Welcome to Victoria Rumble Room, an island show that endeavors to bring you the stories from locally, nationally, internationally, like around the wide expanse of this globe. I'm Robin Adair, and across the wide expanse of Victoria, all the way to Saanich, is my co-host with the most, John Jurisic. And John, lots of international conflict going on right now.
As much as I often, almost always try to start with some levity and humor and moving of the hands, in actuality, the world is kind of depressing right now with all of these international incidents. No kidding, Robin. We have the ongoing war in Ukraine, which doesn't seem to have an end date. We've also got the war in Armenia. Turkey is bombing the Kurds in retaliation for the Kurds bombing Turks. And now, potentially the most devastating and most impactful globally, a terrible situation unfolding in Israel.
That's right, John. We have the Israelis declaring war on the Palestinian organization Hamas. And after this launch of attack from Gaza, where there were rockets fired across Israel and people were abducted and taken into the Gaza Strip, the war has just expanded and it's getting worse and worse. Thousands of people have had to evacuate their homes. Over 1,000 have been killed, and it's just terrible. Israeli aircraft bombing and strafing buildings in Gaza. Reserves have been called out. President Netanyahu is on the warpath. That's not new for him. At the same time, Hezbollah, another Palestinian group based in Lebanon, has launched rocket attacks in northern Israel. This conflict is going on once again, and it has gone on really for almost a century, off and on. It never seems to get dealt with, and you'd love to see cooler heads prevail, at least in the short term, though. I'm not optimistic. People are going to suffer. This is just such a mess.
Growing up, as I have, 60s, 70s, 80s, there are always hot spots around the globe. There's always been conflict for historically forever. Savage fighting in the Balkans. That's where my family comes from. There was ongoing violence in South Africa when white rule was in force. And of course, Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland delivered regular headlines with bombings and shootings. Over time, these conflicts seem to have been settled. But sadly, this is not the case in the Middle East, which remains a tinderbox now and forever. So we'll keep a close eye on this situation, but now let's turn on to other things. How about a little bit of viewer mail, which we get a ton of?
We've certainly had quite a bit this week, John. On a recent Rumble Room, our guest was Carson Binda from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and he was discussing the huge debt that we're building up across the country and also how Canada's productivity numbers are the worst now in the G7. We're talking about the need for more industry employment and less employment from government, as these days it's the public sector that keeps expanding, and along with this, huge deficits and debt along the way. So we've had lots of feedback to Carson Binda and his comments, and comments we've made ourselves on the show. Gary writes us, I believe that at least part of our low productivity stems from our government's willingness to cater to employers by admitting lots of cheap labor, both immigrants and temporary.
Gary goes on to say, normally, there is a real labor shortage, as employers claim. Wages, and when wages go up and businesses invest in productivity. But you know what? Neither of these things are happening in Canada.
Andrew also chimes in on this issue. He says, you say productivity crisis, I hear effort matches wage.
And Armand writes us to say, the productivity crisis that most Canadians have the most experience with are jobs that don't produce a livable wage.
And, he also goes on to say, we have a free enterprise speculative housing market that doesn't produce enough affordable housing and an off-leash consortium of grocery middlemen who don't produce a situation where food is affordable. Now, my understanding in all of this is that when we talk about productivity, we're talking about a measure of how hard people are working at their respective jobs. And I believe that there are Canadians out there that are more concerned about flex time than flexing their muscle or flexing their ingenuity and their intellect. And this is an ongoing problem. We also need immigrants and foreign workers in Canada because a lot of jobs out there our young people simply don't want to do. And at the same time, Canadians are having smaller families and not supplying the manpower and women power that we need to move this economy forward. And as for affordable housing and groceries, well, for me, there's no argument that our current system in those areas really remains a mess.
How does one go on? That's so true. So many issues. We'll dig into other viewer comments on upcoming shows because there's so many. I mean, honestly, for those folks that are not aware, we get upwards of 100 comments on some of our Facebook posts, and these folks are arguing in and amongst each other in the thread. Amazing. But let's talk for a minute or two about the reintroduction of masks at hospitals and health centers. Can you believe it? Yet again, we're talking about this. COVID is on the rise, and there are new vaccinations coming on stream, along with a call to get flu shots. For my part, bring it on. I support this. But there are also people who believe we've gone too far in enforcing mask and vaccination mandates. In fact, that's why the truckers drove all the way to Ottawa and throughout our streets, honking horns and blocking traffic.
They were honking horns right across the country, including Victoria. And certainly this was something that was up for discussion at the National Conservative Convention recently held in Quebec City. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has made noises in the past that he supports that people should have the freedom to choose whether they want to wear a mask or whether they want to get a vaccination. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they choose to do those things without any consequence. But still, a lot of people are looking to the Conservatives and saying we want to have these mandates relaxed. And we asked our Conservative insider, Troy DeSouza, what his position is on the Tories' talk, at least, about freedom of action.
One of the themes that I've seen with his run, and both running for leader, his past history, and now currently as leader, it comes down to one word: freedom. Freedom. It's an encompassing word that gives you the sense of where his lean is, and that means, as much as he can, he wants to give Canadians the freedom to make those choices that are important to them. I mean, I think most Canadians are kind of tired of a lot of the masks. There's some issues certainly with what they, the impacts of vaccinations. There was a horrendous amount of government clamping down on folks with their jobs, their employment based on vaccinations. So I think what Pierre's going to do is he's going to have to focus on what his strength has been, which is give Canadians the most freedom they can within the law. And I think that's the best way to unite them. And what's amazing about it is that we haven't seen a leader in a long time who's generating such support as a Conservative amongst young people. The young people are definitely one of the leading groups of his movement, and as long as he can keep that up, continue to build the bridges with Gen Xers and baby boomers, and create that coalition, I think he'll be very successful. I mean, I'm happy to talk about some pickups on the island. I think he's going to come back into this next election, and he'll take 2 seats on the island, which is one step in the right direction towards getting a potential majority government.
These days, the Tories, according to recent polls, will form majority government again. So I know it's 2 years away, but pretty darn important to hear what these folks are saying about things. Let's hope we can get through this winter without a return to serious mandates. That wasn't fun, and they divide us. On that note, let's shift again to BC politics the conservative movement, as I just indicated, is on the rise across the country, and this is being felt right here in BC, where the BC Conservatives, usually not a topic of discussion, now are higher in the polls than BC United. A split on the center-right is music to the ears of the NDP, Robin. So where can the center-right find some common ground, if at all? Well, Rich Coleman was a longtime cabinet minister and deputy premier as a BC Liberal. He stopped by on the Victoria Rumble Room and talked to us about the big issues facing the province. Let's zoom him in.
Now joining us in the Victoria Rumble Room for the first time, a former deputy premier of this province, longtime BC Liberal cabinet minister under Gordon Campbell and Christy Clark. Welcome, Rich Coleman.
How are you?
Great to have you here and talking to us from beautiful Langley, BC, I expect.
That's true. That's absolutely correct.
So you've held many offices over the years, Rich, and we could start on any number of topics where those things come into play. But let's begin with housing. That's red hot right now. The cost of a home in BC is sky high. And let's face it, it's becoming unaffordable for so many British Columbians. The people that are coming into the important jobs and important times in their lives can't get into a home. You were once the housing minister, and certainly this is a problem that has been growing for decades. It's not a brand new thing. It just gets worse and worse. How did we get here, and what can be done about it?
Well, we got here by supply and demand and delay and timing. And so what happens is when you get immigration and you get in-migration of people and people like to move to British Columbia, you have a supply of housing you're needed. And if there's a shortage of supply, the prices go up. Now, there are solutions, and one of them was actually in place before I left government in 2017. It was called the Affordable Home Ownership Program. If that program had been left in place today, about 60 to 80,000 people would have been able to buy their first home in a program where government helped with the down payment. The money was carried forward for when they sold. They'd be able to get the money back to government, reinvest in other housing for people. The new government canceled that program and haven't replaced it with anything. So I've always believed if you use the power of the asset of the land, process and what have you, reduce the cost and make it possible for young people to get into their first home. And that program was actually working. And then it was canceled because probably just philosophy, not our government, the old government did it and that sort of thing. And sometimes we forget we have things that are working that we should just continue to try.
It's interesting, though. You know, I used to live in the Fraser Valley. I grew up in Mission, and a lot of people from the Lower Mainland used to move out to the valley, places like Abbotsford, Mission, Langley, because they could get into a less expensive home. That's not as true today as it used to be. It's pretty expensive even to live out in the valley. It's pretty expensive to live anywhere on Vancouver Island. It's getting more and more difficult. It doesn't matter how far out of the big centers you live.
That's true. And one of the challenges, if you take a place like the township of Langley where I live, 25% of the land in this community is available to build on. The other 75% of the land is in the agricultural land reserve. So people see land around these communities, they don't realize we can't actually build on it. So that means we have to be very strategic with the land we have. Density is actually king in these situations where you get more density to drive down the price for affordability. And I think we've done a decent job of it, but at the same time of that going on, you see construction costs going up, labor costs going up. You see now today, the real hit now as far as the market is concerned is the interest rates. I've seen a number, just in the last 6 months, a number of projects that I know of, because I've always kept in touch with the business and the industry, because it's a hobby of mine, is a number of projects that are put on the shelf. They're just halted because they can't get the pre-sales. With no pre-sales, there's no financing, there's no ability to build. And so what's happened is the market has cooled down. Stuff that's being built, the stuff that was pre-sold already. And we're really seeing a slowdown. And that's not good for the market, because if the slowdown takes place, it means you're back into significant supply and demand issue.
Yeah. Rich, it's such an honor to have you with us today on the show. Like Robin said, there's so much ground for us to cover. You've done so much in your lifetime. And so why don't we shift to another file that you were once responsible for? In fact, you were the Minister of Public Safety and Solicitor General. Our streets and parks are full of homeless people who are desperate and in some cases dangerous. And that's the added element to this issue, that there's so much crime in and amongst these unfortunate individuals. There were tent cities 20, 30 years ago, and this problem just keeps getting worse. How did we arrive at catch and release in our court system? And what can be done about treatment for addicts and the mentally ill to get them off of our streets?
So let's be blunt to start with. The bluntness is, we blew this file. We decided we would just give people another drug to replace the drug. We've decided that we are not going to save people. We're not going to do the right thing for humanity. So let's take the next step. If we're a society that actually cares about the people in our streets suffering from mental health and addiction issues, we need to decide to strengthen what we do. And the first thing we need to strengthen is we need to step up and say, look, an individual who shows up as an example at an emergency room 3 times in a night and has to be brought back to life with Narcan because they've taken fentanyl, who go back on our street and do it again, is not somebody that's well. They have 2 issues in front of them. One is an addiction, where there's a drug that's taking over their body, and in many cases, a mental illness. And the mental illness can be different, varying multiple barriers. So we have to decide, as a society, are we prepared to step up and help those people get well? Now, we did this, started with the Burnaby Center of Mental Health and Addictions. We built a long-term care facility for people with addictions and mental illness up at Riverview. We also did some therapeutic communities. But what we have to decide is this: if you're that ill, then we should strengthen our Mental Health Act. We should actually take those people into secure care. The first step would be to get them clean and off their drugs, whatever it is they're on, so we can actually get them well enough to then analyze what their mental health issue is and help them get that straightened out. You don't do that with a 28-day program. You don't do that by saying, we'll help you come in and detox and we'll put you back on the street in the same environment you've come from. You do that by putting them in a long-term care situation. And that's where we have to strengthen our act to say, you are so ill, we are going to take you into basically a secured facility for a longer period of time. Usually 18 months is a period of time we get the best recidivism. They live there, they get their help, they get turned around, they can get some care, and then you move them out into, you can move them into other forms of housing, but that housing itself too needs some supports, particularly meals like food and nutrition, but also some rules. You need to have some rules to help them actually streamline into life. And they will get better if you're patient and you take the time. But we as a society always think there's a quick fix. Our medical health officers' quick fix is, well, let's give them another opioid. That's not helping. Other people's quick fix is, well, let's put them into 28-day program. But we know a 28-day program has a 7-day recidivism. They're back on drugs in 7 days, but it costs $1,000 a day for the program. You could take $20 a day and put it into somewhere housing and provide meals, and people would have better outcomes. So we have to decide as a society to shift, be tougher on it, and then we have to do this. On the crime side, we cannot any longer accept repeat offender, multiple offenses, and say, we'll just put you back out. We actually need to incarcerate or put those people, if they're not incarcerated, put them into the type of facility I just described. You have 2 choices. You can go to jail, or you can go to Baldy Hughes outside of Prince George, where you can stay for 18 months and we can help you get better. But you can't say, just go back on the street, because then you're actually destroying your own society from within.
Well, you know, we talk about that quite a bit on this show, Rich, and we talk about the expense, and it seems like society is upset about the situation, but no one wants to pay for it. But, you know, you've been an MLA for a long time. I was looking at your record, and 96 you first got elected when Gordon Campbell first came in. It was his first campaign against Glenn Clark, which he narrowly lost. And you were right in there until what, 2020? You were that whole long stretch. You've seen a lot of stars, political stars, rise and fall in that time. And the latest seems to be, I don't know whether you put this on the rising or the falling, but the rise of the BC Conservative Party, and it seems to be at the expense of the BC United, which is the revamped BC Liberal Party. So, I mean, what do you make of that? Kevin Falcon seems to be having problems getting traction. BC Conservatives suddenly have two MLAs in there, going to get official recognition in the House. I mean, if we have a viable alternative to what was the BC Liberals, does that not cause another split in the right? And is that not music to the ears of David Eby and the government in power?
Anytime there's a split on the other side of the spectrum, whether you're the NDP or the left side, or whether you're the center-right side, the split creates a situation like we saw in 1996 with your first mention of Campbell lost, we lost in 96 with more of the popular vote than the NDP did. But you remember, there were a couple of Socreds, there were some reformers, and there was the BC Liberals. And so what happened was there was enough of a split in certain ridings that caused those ridings to be loose, and government went to the NDP. The split is always difficult, and it's a lot of work to keep it together. I think over the next year, particularly because the election is supposedly in a year from now, that's the set election date. And if Weeby stays true to his word, that's when it will be. They have a lot of work to do. They have to start to bring people back in. Now, I don't see the split as bad on the ground this time as you do just by the virtue of the two gentlemen that are in the House is now BC Conservatives. I don't see the financial and the growth numbers and membership in my area, where I'm very familiar with the Conservative area, because the Conservatives voted for me when I ran the 6 times here. So, I don't see that yet, but I do see this grumbling and the splits there. And of course, you're heading towards a federal situation where you have an unpopular prime minister and it seemed to be up and coming popular conservative leader, which could provide some coattails or not, depending on where people land. I think it's a lot of work for the BC United to actually bring that coalition together.
Of course, just a personal opinion. Certainly over the recent times, BC Conservative leader has been leaning into some cultural related topics that might or might not get him headlines. Frankly, if someone were to focus on affordability and crime, you're going to be premier of the province. And we've just talked about that. Nonetheless, I'd like to switch.
I do totally agree with that. And I think you have to have a platform and an idea of how you're going to put more money in people's pockets, take this pressure of inflation off people. Yeah. I'm telling you, I don't hear the conversation about environment or climate change or anything with any of the people, young people and others that I know, and I've always stepped in contact with people. It's all about how much my groceries are costing me, how much it's costing me to live, because they're trying to take care of their families. And let's remember, they're representing the families of British Columbia. Go do something for the families of British Columbia.
And they want to go downtown and watch a movie and not be scared to go downtown. Anyway,
absolutely.
I'm getting all riled up here. Rich,
you're allowed to do that.
I'd like to ask you a question about energy. As we know, you're once Minister of Natural Gas Development. What do you think of this notion that some municipalities are demanding that natural gas be a thing of the past in new housing? It seems like we're kind of working cross-purpose, building fully functioning LNG pipeline to Kitimat, and at the same time telling people that natural gas is harmful. What's your position on this?
Well, they should give their head a shake, number one. Just give your head a shake. BC and Alberta are sitting on one of the best and largest resources of natural gas. It's the cleanest and easiest to extract in the world. We have countries that every week are building another one or two or three coal power plants. You take one jurisdiction, let's take China as an example. If they've stopped building coal power and they went to natural gas and they changed all their coal to natural gas, they would have reduced the world's emissions by 30%. Natural gas is a fantastic transition. For a municipality to decide to do this in situations where some of the electrical stuff like heat pumps function very well at certain temperatures and not so well at others. And we have to get our head around it. The other thing we have to remember is electricity is not a free good. And we're starting to put stresses on the system. we need to understand that we need to keep our natural gas. I think when municipalities go purist and say we're not going to build any more with natural gas, they're missing the boat. They really are. I mean, even on how you heat a building, now all of a sudden you need to have electrical outlets and electric baseboard heating in every unit versus having a boiler that on a smaller amount of energy would actually heat the entire building with natural gas. It just doesn't make sense. I could go on and on about this one.
Well, and maybe on a future show we'll do that. We'll just dig in on gas and all of the other fossil fuels.
You wouldn't believe what I know about this one. I mean, actually, the proudest moment I had in public life, and it was in 2018, when even the Prime Minister and the Premier of this province and the President of Natural Gas Canada said at the announcement of the final investment in the $40 billion plant in Kitimat, they all said, "This guy got it done," talking about me.
Yeah.
I learned a lot. I'm proud of it, and I think we should get our resources to the world.
Great to hear from Rich Coleman. He's got a wealth of experience in government for so many years, and whether you agree with him or disagree with him, it's always good to hear somebody who has strong views, and that's what we believe in on this show, is sharing views. We don't agree with all the views we get or present on this program. We welcome the letters. We sometimes read letters that we don't agree with at all, but we still think it's important that people have a voice, and we like to reflect what our viewers are thinking about. So it's all good, and we'll try to have Rich Coleman again on a future show. But John, we're about ready to wrap up another Rumble Room.
Yeah, always a tad bit melancholy when that happens. I love doing this with you. There's so many important topics for us to chat about all the time. And we appreciate that over 1.3 million people have cumulatively tuned into our show. And it is over 1.3. I just put all the numbers together recently. And that's how many we have had watch us since we started this 2 years ago. Here's how you can regularly follow us and increase that number for everybody, because when you get over 100 comments, somebody's watching, somebody cares what we're saying, and that starts with Facebook. Of course, we're on X. When do I stop saying that? Twitter? Not yet. We're on YouTube. All of our videos are housed there forever and a day. We're also on these, well, not so much fringe, but for us it is, that being Instagram, that being TikTok, and I say fringe because our shows are created in landscape. For those technical folks out there, and in fact, to get onto those sites frequently, we got to go this way, portrait. Nonetheless, we're also on Facebook news groups. Okay, so that was a little bit of technical talk there for y'all. However, for now, I remain your humble servant, John Jurisic.
You just blinded me with science there, John. I'm Robin Adair, and rumble on.